I've got two hand saws laid out here. This one was my pa's and it's older than I am. This one I bought new about 4 years ago at a big store. Now watch what happens when I put a file to each of them. On the old one the file bites, and you can hear it bite. And in about 6 strokes I've got a fresh edge on that tooth. On the new one, listen, that's the file skating. It isn't cutting anything. It can't. And that's not a defect in that saw. That's the whole design. Here's the twist. Number 3 is the one everybody gets wrong, including me for about 30 years, and it's about a name stamped on half the anvils in this country. Number 2 ran the shop I worked in before I ever set foot in it, and number 1 I owned. You can still buy one today, brand new, for $100. And I am not allowed to use it anywhere I ever used mine. 10 old school tools getting harder to find in America. Let's count them down. Number 10, the wooden folding rule. Before there was a tape measure clipped on every belt in America, a carpenter carried a folding rule. Boxwood or maple. 6 or 8 sections, brass joints at every fold, and it opened out to 6 feet and locked up straight. Lufkin out of Saginaw, Michigan, and Stanley both built whole catalogs of them, and by the middle of the last century the spring tape had run them off the job. Now I'll be straight, because this one is the mildest thing on this list. The tape measure is a better tool for most of what a tape measure does. It's faster, it goes in your pocket, it reads around a corner. Nobody was wrong to switch. But there's one thing the wooden rule does that a tape flat cannot. It's rigid. Open a folding rule out to 4 feet and it holds a true straight edge in the air with no sag in it at all. So you can lay it against a board and scribe a line down it. Pull a tape blade out past 3 or 4 feet with nothing under it, and it droops and curls, and now you're reading a number off a curve and you can't scribe against it at all. You can still get 'em. Crescent Lufkin, which is what's left of that Saginaw company after Apex Tool Group bought the line, still lists wood folding and extension rules today. And they're common as dirt at flea markets, because everybody's grandfather had one and nobody's grandson wanted it. Number 9, the bit brace, and this one's only half gone. A brace is the U-shaped hand crank that holds an auger bit, and an auger bit is the long spiral one with a little screw at the tip. You put your chest on the pad at the top, you turn the crank, and it bores a clean hole through a timber with no cord and no battery and no noise. The bits are fine. Russell Jennings patented his pattern in 1855. Irwin's came along in 1885. Stanley bought Russell Jennings in 1944. And you can buy Irwin's solid center auger bits new today, right now, off an ordinary shelf. I'll say plainly that I don't know where every one of them is made anymore. Irwin's line is spread across several countries and I couldn't confirm which plant those particular bits come out of, so I'm not going to tell you they're American when I don't know that. It's the brace itself that went. Miller's Falls was the big American maker, and in the war years they were shipping something like 20,000 braces a week. And I cannot find anybody manufacturing a new one today. Half the tool survived and half didn't. Here's why anybody would still want one. That lead screw pulls the bit into the wood at its own rate, and the long spiral flutes carry the chips up and out at exactly the speed the screw is feeding. It's a matched system. Put that same auger pattern in a cordless drill spinning 10 times faster and the flutes can't clear fast enough, so they pack solid, and then the bit binds or it burns the wood or it blows a crater out the backside of your board when it breaks through. A brace turns slow and it turns with tremendous torque, and it was built to feed that bit at the rate the bit wanted to be fed. Number 8. The two-man crosscut saw. 6 feet of steel with a handle on each end and a man on each handle, and it's how every big tree in this country came down before the chainsaw. And here's what most people don't know about it, which is that it never actually went away. It's still the working tool on a whole lot of American ground, and the reason is a law. The Wilderness Act of 1964 keeps motorized and mechanized equipment out of federally designated wilderness. That's written into the Code of Federal Regulations, and you can go read it. So when a tree comes down across a trail in one of those areas, nobody brings a chainsaw. 2 people bring a crosscut saw, and since 2016 they have to be certified to do it and carry current first aid. Let me put the honesty brake on that right now, because you'll hear this told wrong. That is not a nationwide chainsaw ban, and it is not all public land. Designated wilderness is somewhere around 4.5% of this country, and even inside it there's an exception process that can allow a motor in specific documented cases. It's a narrow rule doing a specific job. The saw itself is real engineering and not just a long blade. There are 2 kinds of teeth on it. Cutter teeth are sharpened and angled, and they sever the wood fiber. Between them sit raker teeth, which are blunt and don't cut a thing. Their whole job is to scrape the loosened fiber up out of the cut, so the cutters aren't dragging through their own sawdust on the next stroke. Take the rakers out and the cutters pack up and bind, and you'll swear the saw is dull when it isn't. You can buy a new 2-man crosscut. Thomas Flynn in Sheffield, England makes them, and Woodcraft was listing one at a shade under $300 when I checked this in August. That's a British saw, and most of what's actually out there cutting trail is 100 years old, kept going by a shrinking handful of people who still know how to file one. Number 7. A hand plane with a casting worth having. A bench plane is a flat iron body with a blade set at an angle in it, and you push it down a board and it takes a shaving off and leaves the wood flat. Stanley standardized the pattern most of them still follow, starting back in the 1860s and 70s, off Leonard Bailey's patents. And there's a stranger story in these than you'd expect. The planes Stanley made during the Second World War, roughly 42 to 45, have thicker castings than the ones before or after, and the reason is the workforce. The men were gone. The plants were staffed with people who'd never run a grinder in their lives, and they were blowing out thin castings during grinding, so Stanley put more iron in them to survive the learning curve. Same years, the brass went to the war, the nickel plating stopped, the rosewood ran out, and the adjustment wheels started coming out in plastic. After the war, it went the other direction and kept going. The collectors tracked this by type, and it's about as well documented as anything in tools. Rosewood handles gave way to stained beech. The casting detail got coarser. The tolerances loosened. By the 70s, the handles were plastic and the blade stock was thinner, and hand planes had gone from Stanley's main event to a side note in the business. Domestic production ended in the late 90s. Why the casting matters more than the blade. A plane works by staying flat and staying rigid. Thick, well-machined iron sits true on the board and doesn't flex when you lean into the cut. A thin, loosely machined body flexes under pressure and chatters, and it'll leave you a washboard surface no matter how sharp that iron is. People buy a new sharpening stone to fix a problem that's in the body of the tool. The real article is being made right now, and it's better than what Stanley ever built. Lie Nielsen has been making bench planes in Warren, Maine since 1981, out of ductile iron and manganese bronze with cryogenically treated tool steel, materials the originals never had. It costs what it costs. Number 6. A carbon steel blade, and where I have to check myself. Every man in that mine carried a folding knife, and most of them carried carbon steel, because that's what there was. Case moved to their chrome vanadium around 1929 or 30, brought stainless in during the 20s, went hard toward their true sharp stainless in the mid-60s, and by a company newsletter in June of 1981, they were converting whole standard patterns off carbon and onto stainless. Now here's where I have to be careful, because this is the item where old-timers like me lie to you without meaning to. I am not telling you stainless is bad steel. Some of what's being made today is better than anything anybody put in a pocket in 1950, flat out. Case's own people described the choice as personal preference, not one being better, and they're right to. What's genuinely true is narrower than the folklore. Plain carbon steel has a simpler structure in it, and it takes a finer edge, and it comes back to that edge easier on an ordinary stone. The chromium that makes stainless also forms hard carbides scattered through the steel, and those make that last bit of fineness harder to get to with a pocket stone on a stump at lunchtime. And carbon rusts if you don't oil it, and stainless mostly doesn't. So it's a trade, and the trade cuts both ways, and anybody who tells you flatly that carbon is better is telling you a preference and calling it a fact. The real complaint isn't stainless. It's cheap stainless, the soft, easy-to-machine stuff that goes in a $15 folder because it's cheap to grind and won't rust in a blister pack. That's what dulls in an afternoon and won't come back on a stone. You can still buy carbon. Case sells a carbon line today. Opinel over in France has been making them since 1890 and still sells their carbon blade right alongside the stainless one, and they'll tell you outright it wants keeping dry. Number 5. A hand saw you can sharpen. Back to where we started. An old saw blade is taper ground, which means it's ground thinner toward the back and thinner toward the tip, so it clears its own cut without needing much set in the teeth. And the whole blade, teeth and all, sits at one moderate hardness. That's the important part. A file can cut new geometry into it, over and over, for the life of the saw. My paw's saw has been filed so many times the blade is narrower than it left the factory. Here's what changed, and it's a specific patent. A man named Harry Pavitt filed it in July of 1940 for the Simons Saw and Steel Company, and it was granted in August of 1943. Induction hardening. You run electric current through the tooth tips and harden just the tips, and now the teeth hold an edge about 5 times longer than a filed saw does. That's a real improvement, and I won't pretend it isn't. But the same hardness that resists the wood resists the file, and that's what you heard at the top of this video. The file skates. That saw cannot be sharpened by anybody, at any price, with any tool. When it dulls, the entire saw is trash, which is exactly what it was designed to be. I can't tell you what year the throwaway saw took over the hardware store, and I looked. Nobody's pinned that down, and the estimates run across 2 decades. What I can tell you is Diston, which was the American saw, went out of the family in 1955 and got sold on and on after that. And within a generation of that patent, the resharpenable saw was off the shelf. And here's the honest part. I could not find one American company making a resharpenable handsaw today. Not one, not ever, and I looked after she was gone. Not one, not ever, and I looked after she was gone. Spear and Jackson, also Sheffield, since 1760, both English. If somebody's making one here, I couldn't find them, and I'd genuinely like to be corrected in the comments. Number 4, an American bench vise. The vise is the tool that lets you be two men. It holds the work so your hands are free to do something to it, and every shop I was ever in had one bolted to the bench, and ours was a Colombian. The story here isn't a plant burning down, it's consolidation, and it's got dates on it. Colombian Vise and Manufacturing organized in Cleveland in 1926. Warren Tool Corporation bought Colombian in the mid-60s. Wilton bought Warren. Wilton itself got bought in 2014 by an investment outfit and turned into JPW Industries, along with Jet and Powermatic. And I'll flag one thing, because I looked at this twice. The collectors who track it say Wilton bought Warren in 1994. Wilton's own history page says late 90s. Those don't agree, and I can't resolve them for you. What everybody agrees on is that 4 separate American vice companies ended up under one roof, and the Colombian name came off the catalog. The building in Cleveland still has the sign on it. Nobody's casting a vise under that name. Now here's a correction on the pessimism, and I want to give it because this whole genre of video overstates the case. It is not true that nobody makes a vise in America. Wilton says right on their own site that their machinist line and their combination pipe and bench vise are built in the USA. It's specifically the budget lines, the tradesman and the pro, that went to Taiwan and China. And Reed Manufacturing up in Erie, Pennsylvania, has been making vices since 1896 and is still family-owned and still making them here. The Wright brothers had a Reed vise in the bicycle shop. So it's not that nobody makes it here, it's that almost nobody makes the cheap one here. The people still doing it are making the expensive one on purpose. What you're paying for is the casting and the fit. Heavy iron survives a hammer blow coming through the work. A properly fitted slide won't rack when you clamp something off to one side. A light casting with loose rails twists under that, and a thin one cracks at the jaw, which is the exact failure the heavy ones were built not to have. Number 3, an American anvil and the thing everybody gets wrong. I dressed bits in that mine shop for years, and everything I know about hot steel I learned standing at an anvil. So let me give you the correction first, because I carried this wrong myself for about 30 years. Go into damn near any old shop in this country and you'll find an anvil with Peter Wright stamped on the side. And everybody, me included, will tell you that's the great old American anvil. It is not. Peter Wright and Sons was English. They're all over this country because they were imported by the boatload in the 1800s, and we all just assumed. The genuinely American ones were Hay Budden out of Brooklyn, which collectors will tell you was the finest anvil made on this continent. They sold well over 300,000 of them. And Trenton, made by Columbus Forge and Iron in Ohio. And here's the part that makes the confusion make sense. Trenton stamped solid rod on theirs in the same style, because the men running Columbus Forge were descendants of that same English Wright anvil family. Both American companies are gone. Hay Budden went into bankruptcy in February of 1925, after less than 40 years. Trenton stopped making anvils in 1953. What an anvil is actually doing is returning your energy. A hardened face on a heavy body throws the hammer back at you, and that rebound means the force went into the metal you're shaping instead of into the block. A soft cast anvil eats it. It dents, it rings dead, and you do every piece of work twice. Once shaping the steel and once fighting the anvil for what it should have given back. And you can absolutely buy a new American one. Nimba out in Port Townsend, Washington makes them in small batches out of heat-treated alloy steel. Texas Farrier Supply makes ductile iron ones here. Big BLU makes them here. They are not cheap and they are not supposed to be. Number 2. Flat leather belting, and the shop it ran. When I started, there was a steel shaft running the length of the ceiling in that machine shop with pulleys on it, and it hadn't turned in years. It was just up there. And I want to be careful with a word, because in my mouth it can go wrong. That's a line shaft, a drive shaft, not a mine shaft. One long turning rod that powered every machine in a building. Here's how it worked. One engine, or one water wheel, or later one big motor, turned that shaft. Every machine on the floor had a flat leather belt dropped down from a pulley on it. You wanted the lathe running, you shifted its belt onto the tight pulley. That's the whole system, and it ran American industry. Paul Moody put leather belting in place of metal gearing at Lowell, Massachusetts in 1828 to move water wheel power around, and it spread from there through every mill and shop in the country. And it died in a specific narrow window. Between about 1919 and 1929, American industry dropped line shafts for individual electric motors on individual machines, because motors finally got cheap and small enough. That's a 10-year window for a 100-year system. Now the honesty break, because there's a story about leather belts that isn't quite right. You'll hear that a leather belt slips before something breaks, and that this is leather's special safety feature that the rubber V-belt doesn't have. Both of them slip under overload. That's not a leather thing. What leather actually does better is two real things. It's more efficient. A flat belt drive runs a couple percent better than a V-belt, because a V-belt loses energy wedging itself into that groove, and you can fix it where it stands. A leather belt that lets go gets relaced or riveted back together by the man standing there with what's in the shop, and it's running again in 20 minutes. A rubber belt that hardens and cracks with age needs the right part ordered in, and you can still buy it. Flywheel Supply sells new oak-tanned flat leather belting by the foot for steam engines and line shafts and old machinery, and McMaster carries it too. Number 1, the carbide lamp. This is mine. This is the one I owned. 2 chambers, water up top, calcium carbide in the bottom. You crack the valve and let water drip onto that carbide and it makes acetylene gas. And the gas comes up through a little burner tip in the middle of a polished reflector, and you strike the flint and you have light. Frederick Baldwin patented it. Number 6567874, granted August of 1900. They were in coal and ore mines by 1905. And they were everywhere through the First War. 4 to 6 candle power, which doesn't sound like anything until you've been down there with a tallow candle. Now here's where I have to correct the story you've probably heard, which is that carbide lamps got banned. That's not what happened, and the truth is better. They lost. On the merits. Starting around 1918, electric cap lamps came in and they were simply better. More light, longer run, and no open flame in a place where methane is what kills you. And by the 30s, electric had almost completely replaced them. Miners chose. Then, decades later, the regulators finally caught the paperwork up to the practice, and this past year MSHA formally struck flame safety lamps off the list of permissible equipment for underground coal, on the grounds that it's outdated technology nobody uses anymore. That's not a ban that ended an era. That's a death certificate signed 60 years after the funeral, and you can still buy one. Lehman sells a new carbide cap lamp with a flint striker for $100, and they'll sell you the carbide separate. It's an import. It works exactly the way the original works, because the chemistry hasn't changed since 1900. Say the safety part out loud. That lamp makes acetylene, which is a flammable gas, and it's sold for surface use and caving and collecting, not for an underground coal mine. There's a reason for that, and the reason is the entire history I just gave you. So that's the one you can hold in your hand for $100 and cannot use where I used mine. I've got mine on a shelf. It still works. I light it about once a year, outside, for no reason at all except that I like the sound it makes when it catches. Every item on this list is the same story told 10 ways. Somebody had a good thing, somebody found a cheaper way, and the cheap way won, because cheap always wins on a shelf. Here's the number that says it plain. IBIS World, which is an industry research outfit and not the government, puts imports at 60% of American hand tool demand in 2022, up from 48% 10 years before, with China supplying about 43% of those imports. That's a decade of steady ground given up. But I'll not send you off gloomy because the research on this surprised me. Vises, anvils, and planes are all still being made in this country right now by people who chose to. It's the cheap version that left. The good version is still here, it just costs what it always cost, and most of us got used to not paying that. Here's my challenge. Pick one and go put your hands on it. Take a file to a saw you own and find out in 6 seconds which kind you've got. Turn a vise over and read what's cast into it. Or go to a flea market with $4 and come back with a folding rule and open it out and see it hold straight. Then tell me in the comments, and I mean this one specific, what's the one tool in your house that came down to you from somebody? Whose was it, and what county did it come out of? I want to know what's still out there working. None of this was ever about the old days being better. Plenty of what we had was misery. It's that some of these things were made right and got made worse for money, and a man ought to know which is which before he lays his money down. They never wrote it down. I just did.